It's Thursday, the 6th February 2025. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper. The leading story: 54 trillion budget. Experts divided over raise. Federal government adds 4.5 trillion naira agric. Infrastructure funds. President submits review budget. NTEF to NARS. Federal government votes more funds for BOI. Others. You can get all of this story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper and above the leading story from the left. PDP Secretary: Wike camp peaks as BOT backs governors. You can get the complete story on page 21 of the Punch newspaper. Secession: Nigeria didn't learn from civil war, says Dogara. You can get the complete story on page 20 of the Punch newspaper. Transporters: NLC chapters. CUC rejects highway tolling. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. Dangote Refinery: FCCPC differ as NNPCL insists on fuel import. You can get the complete story on page 29 and 30 of the Punch newspaper. Below the leading story: Tinubu demands school safety as fire kills 17 in Zamfara Islamic School. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the Punch newspaper. Edo Tribunal: INEC lists 5 witnesses over Governor Pool. You can get the complete story on page 18 of the Punch newspaper. Nollywood filmmaker jailed for 5 years for drug trafficking. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the Punch newspaper. Ogun assault: Falana receives elderly victim, plans charges against remanded monarch. You can get the complete story on page 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust. The leading story: How 17 children died, 16 injured in Zamfara school fire. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper and below the leading story from the left. Tinubu raises 2025 budget to 54.2 trillion naira. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper. CBN restrict BDCs to $25,000 FS weekly. You can get the complete story on page 27 of the newspaper. Senate okays sack of 3 recs. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the newspaper. World reacts to Trump's bid for US to take over Gaza Strip. You can get the complete story on page 36 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard. The leading story: Experts warn of dangers as Tinubu jacks up 2025 budget to 54.2 trillion naira. As NAS promises to pass budget before the end of February, it is in conflict with CBN policy, says High-Cap boss. It will increase size of deficit, says Adosun, SCIS president. Why 2025 budget was increased to 54.2 trillion naira, says budget minister. You can get all of this on page 5 of the Vanguard and above the leading story. Oando said to distribute 1.28 billion additional shares to shareholders. You can get the complete story on page 20 of the Vanguard. Lagos Assembly crisis: Miranda survives as Tinubu fails to meet GAC team. You can get the complete story on page 21 of the Vanguard. Some estranged ECOWAS members may opt to return, says presidency. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. Electoral fraud: Court sentences Varsity Don, Prof. Udak to 3 years in jail. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Vanguard. Below the leading story from the right: How government officials paid for one hospital project 5 times, says ICPC chairman. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard. Directly under the picture from the left: Petrol: Export price drops by 2.7% to 895 naira per litre. You can get the complete story on page 19 of the Vanguard. PDP crisis. BOT orders NWC to swear in Ude Okoye as National Secretary. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. 2026 FIFA World Cup. Super Eagles receive Okoye boost ahead Rwanda, Zimbabwe ties. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the Vanguard. Moving over to the next paper, Nigeria Tribune. The leading story. Like governors, PDP BOT endorses Ude Okoye as National Secretary. Wants him sworn in immediately. It's an invitation to anarchy, says Ayanwu. You can get all of this on page 3 of the newspaper and above the leading story from the left. Fire kills 17 children, injures 16 others in Zamfara Amajiri School. You can get the complete story on page 16 of the newspaper. Government officials paid 100% for same hospital project 5 times without constructions, says ICPC boss. Says another listed wife, son-in-law on payroll. You can get all of this story on page 4 of the Tribune and below the leading story from the left. Tinubu approved 65 years retirement age for doctors, healthcare workers. You can get the complete story on page 15 of the newspaper. Declare Ondo oil producing coastal community disaster zone. Reps tell federal government. You can get the complete story on page 25 of the newspaper. Suspended Ogun monarch fails to meet bail conditions. Remanded in Ilaro prison. You can get the complete story on page 16 of the newspaper. Tinubu writes Senate. 6 increase of 2025 budget to 54.2 trillion naira. 4.5 trillion naira additional revenue will support economic diversification, says Budget Minister. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper. CBN restricts BDCs to 1 dealer bank per week for $25 FS purchase. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the newspaper. Moving over to the last paper on the list, The Guardian, the leading story. 5 years on, poor funding. Capacity humbles Amotekun's mandate in Southwest. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian and below the leading story from the left. Tinubu okays 65 years retirement age for health workers. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Federal government eyes diversification, infrastructure, security in 4.53 trillion review of 2025 budget. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. Suspended Ogun monarch remanded in correctional center over assault. You can get the complete story on page 8 of The Guardian. Nigeria's opt-out growth may slip to 0.8%, says report. You can get the complete story on page 15 of The Guardian. PDP trustees move meeting to hotel over security concerns. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Dangote begins fuel exports to Saudi Arabia. Pushes capacity to 550,000 BPD. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Federal government. WFP invests 1.2 billion naira, $2.5 billion to tackle hunger. Nutrition. You can get the complete story on page 5 of The Guardian. Oando rewards shareholders with 1.28 billion shares. You can get the complete story on page 29 of The Guardian. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper and read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.